Septuplets, sextuplets, 30-second notes, oh my! Today's video is actually a follow-up to last week's video where I went over this really neat subdivision exercise to make sure that you're really comfortable transitioning between subdivisions. And in today's video, I'm going to go over some of the more complicated subdivisions to explain how they work. There were a couple questions in the comments of last week's video to do some more of these complex subdivisions, so thank you so much for leaving that comment, and remember that you can always comment any ideas or any questions that you have about playing, and I will very likely make a video about it. When dealing with these two different kinds of subdivisions, it's good to be able to sort of split them into two categories. The first category of which is going to be like symmetrical subdivisions. So symmetrical subdivisions are pretty easy because you can think of them almost just like normal subdivisions, just on a sort of smaller, faster scale. So for symmetrical subdivisions, there's sextuplets and 30-second notes. The reason why these are called symmetrical is because they can be split perfectly in half and actually line up with the eighth note beat. So these are two ways that sextuplets and 30-second notes are written and notated. There's some variety, like sometimes you might see this line missing in the sextuplets and you just have the two 3 and 3, and I actually like this notation for it pretty well, but usually that'll be connected. Usually on 30-second notes it won't be connected, so you'll have that bit of separation, but sometimes you may see those lines connecting it too. It's a little bit inconsistent how these things are notated, but it's nice because these are very easy to count because you can just think about where the eighth note lines up. So obviously this is the downbeat, and then the eighth note lines up perfectly on a beat. With the symmetrical subdivisions, then you can see how just like a quarter note sort of splits into two notes to be two different eighth notes, the eighth notes in the case of the sextuplet split into three notes to be a sextuplet. So each eighth note is splitting into three notes. So then the way that you can count this is either you have your beat, one triplet, then and triplet. So that would sound like one triplet and triplet, one triplet and triplet, one triplet and triplet, one triplet and triplet. And that's with snapping the eighth note beat. Snapping the quarter note beat then becomes one triplet and triplet, one triplet and triplet, one triplet and triplet. You could also, if you're used to counting triplets as like triplet, you could just do triplet, triplet. That's sort of what I tend to do when I'm thinking of it in my head, but I actually think the one triplet and triplet is better. For one, because triplet is actually a two-syllable word, and to get the three syllables, you sort of have to put the triplet. And it also helps you to keep track of where you are in the actual beat. So if you're thinking one triplet and triplet, one triplet and triplet, you know where the downbeats are and where the upbeats are. Whereas if you're just doing triplet, 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 you might not have that inflection of like what's a downbeat and what's not a downbeat. And of course, since 30-second notes are also a symmetrical subdivision, it basically works the same where we have the eighth notes lining up. And then it's like instead of having this eighth note becoming three notes, it's becoming four notes now. So the way that I like to count this is similar to how I count 16th notes or the sextuplets sort of combined. So this first eighth note worth is one E and a, and then the next eighth note worth I call and E and a. This is a little bit cumbersome to say, but it gives you that same proper grouping of notes, one E and a, and E and a, one E and a, and E and a, one E and a, and E and a, so that you're really keeping track of one and keeping that really precise, and then that allows you to fill in the rest of the 30-second notes appropriately. And of course, you can also continue this or change it for different meters. So say that you're playing in a triple meter, like a 6/8 or a 9/8, or anything where it's a compound beat instead of a simple beat, and you have three eighth notes to the beat. You just add another set of your four note subdivisions, or three notes if you're doing sextuplets, and then you're good to go with another. In this case, I might do one E and a, E and a, E and just like how I would count this 1 and 2 and 3 and so forth. So you can always take your sort of root or your more basic subdivisions of eighth notes or even quarter notes and then just see how you can split that up and make it make sense for whatever subdivision you may need to play. You can even think of the same principle of subdivision working for a little bit more simple and familiar subdivision, like just normal 16th notes, where again, we're taking these eighth notes, but then we're splitting them up into two. So we still have the 1 and the and are lining up with the eighth notes, and then we just split the eighth notes very evenly. So we go from 1 and 1 and 1 E and to E and so that we're keeping that idea of the subdivision going. So hopefully seeing this on the simple version, or if you're struggling with this idea of how the 16th notes work, that'll help you see how sextuplets and 32nd notes are really not so different than just straight 16th notes. You're just dividing even further into smaller subdivisions. Now the other category gets a little bit more complicated, and that's the asymmetrical subdivisions. So asymmetrical subdivision happens whenever you have an odd number of notes per beat. So in this case, it's quintuplets and septuplets. Because it's an odd number, you can't just split the beat evenly where you have it lining up evenly, like 3 notes on an eighth note, then 3 notes on an eighth note, because you can't divide 5 or 7 into 2 even halves. This means that your eighth notes are going to still line up, of course, with the very first note. That's nice that the first note's always on the beat. But the second eighth note is actually going to be more sort of like in between or just after one of the notes instead of lining up perfectly with the notes like we had with the symmetrical subdivisions. One quick sort of bonus tip, so far we're working with like 16th note quintuplets and 16th note septuplets, but if you ever see like an eighth note quintuplet, what that changes is that it changes what notes it's lining up with. So in this case, we have the eighth notes happening here, which means that these 5 notes have to happen in the length of a quarter note. But if these were eighth note quintuplets and like this line was erased, then we would have this being quarter notes, and these 5 notes would then fit within a half note. A trick to maybe remembering that, if that's tricky, is to go down 2 subdivision levels, basically. So 16th note septuplets go back from 16th notes, eighth notes, quarter notes. So 16th note septuplets will fit within 1 quarter note, 7 notes in a quarter note. If you have an eighth note quintuplet, then you go back to subdivisions, eighth notes, quarter notes, half notes, and 5 eighth note quintuplets will fit within 1 half note. So now let's look at how to actually count these rhythms. So for the asymmetrical ones, the very best way to do it is to just come up with like a 5 or 7 syllable word. My preferred one for quintuplets, the one that I use, is university. So you can see university has 5 syllables, so you basically just fit the word university evenly within a beat. University, 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 university. Another popular one is hippopotamus. Hippopotamus, hippopotamus, hippopotamus. It can work with any 5-syllable word. And it's the same idea for a septuplet, but you have to come up with a 7-syllable word. The super nerdy one that I use that I mentioned in the video on subdivisions last week is Clarinet Symposium. There are other options as well. One of the funnier ones is This Is Very Difficult, which is a 7-syllable phrase. So of course, if you can't come up with just one word, and even Clarinet Symposium isn't one word, but as long as you have 7 syllables in there so that you can say it as you play the beat. Clarinet Symposium, Clarinet Symposium, Clarinet Symposium, Clarinet Symposium, then you're in good shape. One other way that you could do these if you don't want to be as fun and silly as this, it's slightly less effective though, is to just say the numbers. So like on a quintuplet, you could say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On a septuplet, you could say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And if you listen carefully, you'll notice that I'm not saying 7 because 7 is actually 2 syllables. So if you said that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then you're actually saying 8 notes. So you have to sort of abbreviate it to just sev so that you're only saying 7. The one other way that these sometimes get counted, which isn't the best way in my opinion, but can kind of work if you're very careful about it, is by doing actual groupings within it. So for example, you can sort of try to force these to be more symmetrical, where with the septuplet, you can group it into 3 notes and then 4 notes and count 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. The thing to be very careful about this though is that the ones of that grouping won't line up with the beat. So it's not, if I'm snapping eighth notes, it's not 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. Because you can hear that that's not evenly divided, right? That rhythm, in fact, would be 3 notes of a sextuplet and then 4 30-second notes. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's actually faster and it's not an evenly subdivided septuplet. The benefits of doing it this way, though, are nice because you can get some really nice note groupings and be very musical, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, and have that nice and organized, and that might help out your fingers and be useful for that, but you have to be very, very careful that you're not lining this up and forcing it to be symmetrical, because it is in fact asymmetrical, and you won't be playing exactly the right rhythm if you put these on the beat and don't make it asymmetrical but force it to be symmetrical. Same thing with fives. A common one is to do 1, 2, 1, 2, 3 like this. But again, you have to be very careful that you're not going 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and changing the speed and lining these up with the eighth note, because the eighth note belongs over here, not right in line with the beat. But again, it can create some nice, helpful note groupings as long as you're making sure it's 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and having it very evenly spaced out. And now that you know how these subdivisions work and how they split up the notes, you can use them in more practical examples. Septuplets and even quintuplets, usually you'll find just a straight beat's worth of them, so it'll be just 7 notes or just 5 notes in a row. Occasionally you'll have some other notes in there, or maybe you'll have some rests, in which case the best thing to do is just sort of count your rests through it and then play when you play. So that would be if you had something like this. For this case, I would still count it university, but I would just keep the uni part of it silent, so that you'd end up saying university, 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 university. So like the rests are on the uni part, and then you have the rest of the versity there at the end. Again, with the asymmetrical ones, you usually will just have the full beat of notes there. Occasionally you have those few rests, and that's the best way to do it. But for the symmetrical ones, you can actually see lots more different combinations, and knowing how these subdivisions work will really help you to figure out how to count them precisely. A really common one that comes up a lot, and it's actually in the rows 32 etudes quite frequently, is the dotted eighth note and then 2 30-second notes, which if you look closely or think about it for a moment, this is very similar to a more friendly rhythm, the dotted eighth 16th, but you can see that this last 16th note is just being split into 2 30-second notes. So if you would normally subdivide the dotted eighth 16th and think about all of the 16th notes in here, 1, E, and A, then you can do sort of the same thing with this, where you have 1, E, and are still in the dotted eighth note, but then becomes what I'll call and a. So in this case, just because there's a couple 30-second notes here at the end of the beat, we don't need to subdivide all of the 30-second notes, the whole beat, and be like 1 E and a, Andy and a, 1 E and a, Andy and a, to get that really precise. If you were going super, super, super slow, maybe you would want to do that, but you can just subdivide the 16th notes and then just split up that last 16th note there. So with the symmetrical subdivisions, it's a little bit easier, and you have a little bit more options in terms of going between like 16th note subdivisions to 32nd note subdivisions, or 8th note subdivisions to sextuplet subdivisions, and you have that option there. And then you can see how it will all work out, and you can sort of relate it to simpler rhythms to make it make more sense. One last pretty common example, and some variations of this are also very common, is like an eighth note and then a sextuplet. And usually when you have a sextuplet like this, it'll just have a 3 over it, which makes it more like a 16th note triplet actually, because there's only 3 notes rather than 6. And really, sextuplets are just 16th note triplets, but 2 of them back to back, so you get 6 notes instead of just 3. So in this case, you should be really well equipped to do this, where it's just 1, and then the next 8th note would be here, but instead of an 8th note, it's split into 3, so you have 1 and triplet. The important thing to be really careful of is making sure that this and is still where it would be as if it was a normal 8th note, 1 and triplet, 1 and triplet. And you're not doing something where you're sort of smoothing this all out and making it 1 and triplet, 1 and triplet, 1 and triplet, because that's sort of more like 16th notes where it's all evenly spread out, but we need 1 and triplet, 1 and triplet. So it's really on the normal position of the 8th note, then split into 3 notes. So hopefully you can see how these different, more complicated subdivisions can sort of line up with subdivisions that we already know and are comfortable with. And it's a little bit tricky to be moving between like 16th notes to 32nd notes or 8th notes to 16th note triplets. But that's what last week's exercise was all about, to get those subdivisions and get comfortable moving from subdivision to subdivision. And that's a really important skill to have, as well as understanding how all of these subdivisions fit in and work together. So I hope that answers your questions. Thanks so much for asking about this in the comments. And remember, if you have any more ideas or questions or things that you would like to know about the clarinet or music in general, feel free to leave those in the comments as well. And then subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon so you get notified whenever I make the video that you're requesting. Thanks so much for watching this one, and I will see you in another video.